So let's dive right into it. George St-Pierre retires the champion. And and the greatest of all time. Actually, he didn't retire the champion. He gave that up. That wasn't the most important thing to him. Why did I start with an open statement? Just so Mark can make a segment on YouTube. But George St-Pierre he's a genius. He's my friend. He's somebody I've always looked up to. He's somebody many of us look up to. If you're Canadian, you probably have just a little extra thing, because there's something about Canadians where we're
he's a national hero.
Yes.
For us, at least.
He is. Like, do we have very many of those? That basketball player people like with the long hair.
Oh, Steve Nash.
Steve Nash, people liked him. What else? What else we got?
Well, aside from the hockey players that are like the standard,
right. Brian Adams. You like Brian Adams? No, I don't mean to laugh at Brian Adams. He writes some great songs. But we don't have a ton. Like
Grammy record artist Snow.
Yeah, Snow, outstanding hip hop and reggae artist. But no, we don't have a lot of heroes in Canada, and George was definitely one of them. So any of us who grew up doing martial arts, wearing gis and stuff, the guy even came out with a gi and a headband. So that's, we all love that. He also is very Canadian. He's quiet and humble and apologetic and polite. And it's not an act. It's just what our environment teaches us. Okay, of course I'm going to talk about George fighting in just a moment. Humor me, this is my podcast. George, to be a Canadian is to be in that environment. And when you should really see it. We're in a sort of a nice area of downtown Toronto. People will argue politely over who holds the door. And then when you bump into somebody, someone will say, I'm sorry. It's like, no, that's my fault. No, I'm sorry. Like, it's ridiculous. It's real, though. That's how we are. The way you are is created by your environment and the people around you. You start off as a little kid, and the way you learn how to be an older kid and then a grown-up is by modeling those around you. I am a big fan of Russia. I enjoy going to Russia. I've really made great friends with Russian people, and I love the Russian fighters, and I love working and commentating and analyzing fighting in Russia. I love it. They're very different than Canadians. They're just the same people. They have the same sensitivity, and we're all the same. Doesn't matter where in the world you're from, but the way you express yourself is different. And New York, very much like Moscow, New York City. The speed at which people have to move and stuff, they don't have time for that kind of politeness. And in fact, I was in Moscow with George St-Pierre and I were there together. Separate, I was there contributing a commentary piece and meeting with a fighting team about doing work for them. George was there cornering his friend, but we spent a lot of time together. And they look at us like we're weird. And my Russian friends said almost a little crazy when you're like, oh, excuse me, please, may I? They're like, what the fuck is wrong with you? And they're not being judgmental. It's just so foreign. Which is how Canadians feel when they hear Americans yelling at each other on the street. Although both sprinkle into each other. So George is ultra Canadian. He's also a martial artist of martial artists. He's a learner and a grower and an evolver and in constant search of self-improvement. And these are the things that we look up to him for. So let's talk about today. Today is only a few days after the man retired, and he did it the way that he wanted to do it. So a quick recap. So I don't know what I want to talk about with George today, because I'm only going to do the podcast, with going to fights today, maybe an hour and 40 minutes. Maybe me and Mark will hang out for 2 hours and 20 minutes. We don't have a plan. But I could spend all of it talking about George. We could talk about the way that he combined all of the different segments of fighting. At the time, it was quite a segmented martial art. Now, free fighting has become a blended art form. At the time, it was very segmented. We can talk about that. We can talk about the way that George evolved as an athlete, not a fighter or a combat sportsman or a martial artist, but as a pure athlete. We can talk about George's career. We can talk about avenging the only 2 losses he had. All of this we could talk about this forever. But I'm just sort of flowing with what feels right as I think out loud about this man that is a friend and I admire greatly. So we start from backwards. He retires on maybe Wednesday of this week, and he does it. He really would have liked another fight with Khabib Nurmagomedov. And this is a lesson that we learn about life. This is, again, fighting is there to teach us lessons. Sorry, I'm all over the place. I don't know if it's too much caffeine or what. But we learn lessons about life through studying these people, and you can do that through anything. I have a friend who plays a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, and he always talks about, life is like when you go into a dungeon and there's goblins, and it's there for you if you want. It's all metaphor for each other. George wanted to fight Khabib. Khabib wanted to fight George. And many people who are in the world of negotiation will tell you, the only way you can truly negotiate what's fair for you or what you think to get the best that you can get is you must truly be willing to walk away. Not pretend to be willing to walk away, not imply that you would walk away, but you must be truly willing to walk away. So you say to them, I want to fight Khabib. I want to fight him for a title. And they come back and say, well, no, we need you to fight a contender. You're not going to do that. Like, I will walk away. It has to be that way. If you're going to truly be in a position to do things on your own terms, and most of us will never be in that position, not in the world that we live in. But George put himself into a position where, through his own hard work from the time he was a child, he found himself in the position to be able to do things on his own terms. I want to fight Michael Bisping. He's the middleweight champion of the world. I want to go up to middleweight and fight him. Humming and hawing and money and whatever. They come back, and I know this because I was around. I was doing a documentary of George at the time. They came back and they said, we don't think, we're going to have to, and when I say they, there are many people in any organization. We'll say the UFC did X, or they did X. It's not a machine with a bunch of little automatons inside, like churning something and the machine makes decisions. It's just people. The UFC or Nike or Coke or the government or whatever is just people. A bunch of people doing the best they can. So those people came back and said, we think that it'll cost money to teach the audience who you are because you've been gone so long. George's people said, look, we want to fight Michael Bisping. I don't need to fight. I'm George St-Pierre. I've done everything I needed to do. I do love martial arts, so I would love to do it, but I'm doing it on my own terms or I'm not doing it at all. And before you judge that, this is what you should be seeking in your life. Don't judge it or be like, who does he think he is? This is what you want. This is what you want to create. This is the whole point of anything that you're doing outside of the things you do for love. You're trying to create a scenario where you can get things on your own terms. Most of the time, that's going to take much of your life. These things might happen in George's case, what was he, 36 or 37? And through a lifetime of work and accomplishment, at 37, he found himself in a situation where he could finally get what he wanted on his own terms. Now, then even your own terms have to change. They would then come back and say, it's going to cost a lot of money to re-educate the audience who you are. And there are people would then, and I heard this just lingering around as I did a documentary on George. None of this is inside information. Nobody gave me things I shouldn't have heard. I didn't read any secret documents that I found laying around at the fucking George's workout bat cave. I just heard these things. And so what you come back and you say, okay, that's a risk. You don't want to risk money. That's okay. Why don't you give us more pay-per-views for the Canadian pay-per-views? And I think this is pretty public knowledge that George received higher pay-per-view points for the pay-per-view sold in Canada. Now, if you think about that, his people are then like, we sure want to sell pay-per-views in Canada. Hey, Robin Black wants to do a documentary for the biggest network, TSN. Yeah, let's do it. So it's ended up being good for me too, because I really wanted to follow George. Because in following George, I not only saw how a super athlete lives, I not only saw how a good man lives, but I saw all of the business around somebody who had built a life to a point that he could live it his way. And that's all any of us are looking for. That's all any of us are looking for. If you want to be a billionaire, I'm sorry to say that's been taught to you by a culture that has sort of celebrated being rich. Being a billionaire is not going to be any better for you than having $5 million. Trust me, I don't have anywhere near either of those things, and I probably never will. but I certainly am not seeking those things, and neither was George. George ended up making a really great living because George sought greatness, perfection, improvement, actualization, trying to become the best human being he could, trying to become the best martial artist he could, trying to become the best fighter, a champion, a leader. That's how George got rich. But because now at this point he was rich, and because now he did not need to fight for money, for, purpose, for anything. Fighting was there. I can tell you actually why George wanted to fight. This is Michael Bisping. I can tell you why he wanted to fight Michael Bisping. Because George lives to train. George lives to grow as a martial artist. That's what he loves to do. And there's just the session of training. The only way to make it better than it is, as it is, training is wonderful. You can experience that thing as a child. All you want to do is do martial arts and learn, and George loves it, loves it. What can make that thing better? There's more meaning if you're training because Michael Bisping's trying to kill you. There's more. Each session has more meaning. So the very thing that he loves to do becomes all that much more visceral and real and meaningful if he has a fight. That's why George missed having a fight. He hates fighting. You can watch the documentary. He talks about it at length. I don't know where it is. I think it's on Crave TV, which is like Netflix in Canada. But I'm sure, if you go to, Kaposa or Zombie Prophet or one of these like Twitter accounts and you say, hey, where do I find this? Those guys will all know, right?
Pretty sure.
Who else are some of those guys who are go-to guys for everything? There's a few of these guys. Yeah. You want to find something, they'll always find it. Then they'll even be posting stuff you're not allowed to post, and sometimes they'll post it, or sometimes they'll direct you to it. They know where the shit is. Anyways, you want to see that documentary? It was a pleasure to build. But so George wanted to fight for that purpose. Doesn't need the money. Doesn't need a legacy. That's a whole different conversation. We'll have on another day. What is legacy and what isn't it? It's not what you think it is. Not what they say it is. It's just what it is. And he could do it on his terms. So it's like, want to fight at 185, I want to fight Michael Bisping, etc. He did. He beat him. It was amazing. And I love Mike. I went to Mike's after party, not George's, because Mike's going to be a lot more fun even when he loses. And no offense, George knows I love him, but a after party of George St-Pierre winning is still not going to be as fun as an after party of Michael Bisping losing. And that's the truth. And plus, Mike's a wonderful guy. And as much as I was happy for George, Mike was the champion of the world. That was his lifetime he had dedicated to it. So George did that. There we were. Now, here we are again. If there's going to be another one, they say legacy. Again, we'll talk about that on another day. But, we talk about legacy. Tell me Michael Jordan's legacy, anybody. You don't know. Fucking tell me who paved these streets, the street I live on, what generation built them. Nobody knows history, right? So we talk about legacy as if it's something that's going to last forever. It will if you Wikipedia it, but nobody is going to. And if I get 1,000 Americans or Canadians and I say, tell me about Michael Jordan, maybe they all say he was a champion, he was the best, but they can't tell me anything else. So it doesn't matter if you end up fighting Khabib or Tyron Woodley or whoever at this stage, they're going to, 10 years later, they're going to say the same thing. George St-Pierre was the best. So that's not really that important. It's important because he loved the challenge of it. He'd never really faced somebody with the specific skills, that they're truly that power grappling, that desire to manhandle you and abuse you. He'd never face that. I'm sure he'd love to face that, and I'm sure his team would love to face that. And he'd like to fight for another title, and if he can't, then buy, right? And here's the frustration. Audience wants it. So there's 4 key ingredients. Audience wants it. George wants to fight Khabib. Khabib wants to fight George, but the company says you can't have it. Okay, we'll retire. That's what it is. That's the lesson here. Is if you truly put yourself into the situation to go after what you want, you must be willing to walk away for real. If you're going to do things on your own terms. George's own terms was, Khabib for the title, this is what I want, this is what I have put myself in a position to ask for, or I retire. Not, okay, to have this, you must also do this. No, I'm not fighting another contender. I'm not taking brain damage. I'm not putting myself in risk. This or retire. Can't have this. They should have given him that, to be honest. It's the right move from every standpoint, business and everything would be, if the audience wants it and everybody else wants it. There's conversations about divisions and stuff, but tell me, instead, interim title of two guys, one's a featherweight. Like you're talking about people moving from other divisions to hold up divisions with belts they're going to walk away from. We do that every week.
And especially like with all due respect to all the current UFC champions, this happens in the era of where the title is the most meaningless.
Yeah. Yeah. The title
has the least amount of value that it has ever had right now.
Yeah, we're going to talk, if you're listening to this as a one-off, it's a love letter to George and appreciation. Then later in the show, in another segment, we'll be talking about Poirier versus Max Holloway. Wonderful fight. But yeah, I mean, they're different weights and one has a thing and one would be interim. I mean, you on one hand, that's how it is. On the other hand, no, we don't want George. None of that's right. What it roots down to is I make these decisions around here and I say, no, you're going to do it my way or not at all. Okay, not at all. It is.
Well, I mean, it's not to get off topic with George. It's just the idea behind that every pay-per-view needs to be a title fight pay-per-view. Meanwhile, the most recent one, due to injuries and whatnot, Anderson and Israel was the main event.
Yeah, it was one title fight. Yeah, super cool fight. People liked it.
And the one prior to that, the last non-title fight prior to that was Anderson versus Nick Diaz. Yeah. Nick Diaz, which was great too.
Also great. So we'll talk about that a little in the Poirier and Max Holloway thing, but Max Holloway chat, early analysis. But but part of that at this stage of your career, who are you and what are you? Like your goal in life. Our goal, all of ours, should, if we look at things and really are seeking happiness and success and that feeling of serenity that you're living your best life, as they say it, we throw that around a lot. Like somebody will be like, I went to yoga today, I'm living my best life. It's like, okay, well, that's pretty good. Or, oh man, we rented a car and went away for the weekend, I'm living my best life. And it sounds like I'm mocking that, but literally that might be like, what are we looking for? Being Beyonce or a billionaire that's not what we were put on earth to do. We were put here to share ideas and grow and learn and become something and give something and influence people in a positive way, make the world a better place. That's what George tried to do. So, and there'll be thousands not thousands, there'll be dozens or hundreds of people looking back at George's career at a variety of levels. He came up. I've got 2 breakdowns. There'll be a third soon on Instagram and Twitter of him coming up at UCC and which later became TKO. That was the Canadian ones. And the first thing people notice on the breakdowns is on his back. It says goldenpalace.com. And it's like literally he's just a kid and it says goldenpalace.com and henna tattoo. And he got somewhere probably between maybe $700 to about $2,000 extra. A lot of the fighters, the main card fighters would wear that on their back, the same way that like a car will get on their hood, it'll say Snickers or whatever, right? And the same thing. And George would take all that money, every fucking penny that he ever earned, he always spent it on training. Training partners, training equipment, travel. He would make it when he didn't have much. He'd make himself poor and have to work a day job or a night job to be able to have enough money to put it back in. He was never cheap when it came to training. Training partner needed food, he'd pay for it, even when he didn't have money. And now, when I traveled with him for the Bisping fight, he would have the entire team. He fed them every day. Of course, he doesn't have any bad habits. He's not a spender. He's not a gambler. He's not a drinker. He doesn't do drugs. I mean, nothing. Like, training and martial arts is his life. So he always paid for dinner. He always paid, if once every few weeks they went out to a nightclub to listen to bad French hip hop. That's what he likes. He would pay for all of it. He would pay for them to travel. He'd pay for their hotels. That's at the stage where he's very successful. In the early days, he would do what he could do. He would rent the car. They would travel together. They would go to New York, Renzo Gracie, John Danaher, and and Faraz would go too, because Faraz as a black belt still always learning as well. And they would always cross-pollinate. He gathered that information early. And in the early days, and trust me, this is not how it is anymore. You do not you do not segment your fight up into, I got to train my wrestling, I got to train my boxing, I got to train my Muay Thai, and I got to train my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. How am I in all four? Well, I'm a really good Jiu-Jitsu player. I'm a black belt, but my wrestling's not that good. But, my boxing is, but I'm defensively. It's not like that now. It's all holistic. We look at fighting. Also, how is my athleticism? How's my speed? How's my vertical leap? How much power can I generate? How well do I recover? All of that was segmented. Back almost like Moneyball, if you ever watch baseball, and they look at in the early days, stats was so influential, and it still is, and it's still talked about that way, and still consumed that way. People who love baseball, one of the things they love about it is stats, but it never worked past that. And fighting has worked past that. It isn't segmented like this, but in the days that it was, George just wanted to max up everything. He wanted to run faster, jump higher, recover better, kick better, have a better understanding of timing, etc., etc., etc. Beat the jiu-jitsu guys in jiu-jitsu, wrestle with the best wrestlers, box with the best boxers, and fight Muay Thai with the best Muay Thai guys, and then blend it in the fight and in the sparring sessions. Again, that's not how it's done now. The reason it's all holistically done now, and it's all seen as one thing, Stylebender, if you say, I want to see how his wrestling is again. His wrestling is his fighting, is his kicking, is his punching, is his flowing. It's all the same thing now, right? You aren't better in one thing than another. Sorry. You will be sharper. There will be things that you are better at. Your right hand punches better than your left, and you make space better than you maintain an overhook. And there are elements of it, but it isn't categorized that way. Somebody can be incredible at getting back to their feet and not all that good at being able to rip that whizzer out. Well, they'll work on that. But the flow of the whole picture is together. But the reason that happened is because of Frank Shamrock, George St-Pierre, Pat Miletich, people like this. People who said maybe they didn't know exactly where the recipe was going when they were stirring it up. At the time, they were like, all we can do is make all the ingredients fucking delicious. And so that's what they did. And George was the best at it. I could talk, as I said, I could talk about George forever. And we will much more. We'll find times in the future to go back and look at the things I learned from studying him, analytically and being around him. But when I traveled with him and when I have trained with him before, to watch him is to see what it truly is to be desperate to find your weaknesses. Like he wants to find them so bad. And over time, he doesn't have very many. Like it's not like, when he has control of your chin while passing to mount, threatening a choke, he slowly loses control with his elbow. It's not, they're minor, they're tiny. How well does he squash this or slide that? It isn't like my jiu-jitsu needs improvement or I'm not as good at arm bars. It's way more subtle than that. That's how deeply he's looking at it. And when he finds something that is not quite where he wants it, the joy with which he exists in those moments of discovering something he can improve, you see it. And then he obsesses over it. He was at a place where a lot of NFL players train conditioning, strength, and sort of functional athleticism for their sport in LA. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head. And there was a jumping agility / direction change / explosive, energy transfer kind of athletic thing that he was doing where you would jump and change direction on multiple boxes, being light and powerful and agile, and there was a rhythm element to it. It's very complicated. It didn't look like much, and if you were a really high-level hip-hop dancer or maybe a drummer or certain people, that combination of tools and timing and rhythm and stuff would be easy. But George, even as a high-level martial artist, he wasn't quite getting it, and he just wouldn't go till he had it. And it wasn't even like there was elements of joyful frustration in there, but for the most part, that's just the default thing he does. And he would have stayed there an hour extra if he took it. It took him 12 minutes or 8 minutes or 13 minutes. Yeah, maybe a little less. He did it 12 or 15 or 18 times until he had it. That's just what he does. While I also traveled with him, he had found somebody in France who trains your nervous system to respond, because if it can respond a millisecond or two quicker to something that you see and do, well, that's powerful. So he trained with him. That helped. I don't know if he invested in the guy's company or what, helped move him to Montreal, trained with him. He had exercises to train where you like roll your eyes in a particular way while stretching out your tongue to train your peripheral vision that he would do just while sitting around. And I remember when I was doing it, and it was like, and your tongue is sticking out, and he's like, no, stick it out. And suddenly it occurred to me, he's filming this and he's just totally punking me. And I'm like, literally, you know, you've got your eyes going one way, and he's like, if you stick your tongue out really hard, it'll stress the muscles of your peripherals to cause I'm like doing this thing, and I'm like, George is fucking with me. And then I look over, no, he's not. That's literally what he's doing. He's trying to find a 1% improvement in his ability to see down here, out there, and out there. Because if you're looking forward, there's a point at which you lose sight of your finger. Okay, you can't see your finger anymore. You know, if you look this way, you can. And if you're looking this way, there's still a point you can't see it. Well, what if that's an overhand punch? Well, George doesn't want to leave that to chance. He's going to train it so he can fucking see further. Some of that shit that he did ended up being myth, or, you know, misinformation. Or if you do this, it'll make you better in this way. And it turned out it wasn't quite as good as the modern science. That's okay, because he was training himself to train himself. He was learning how to learn. He was, you know, improving his ability to improve his abilities. That's all part of it. You never met a man like George St-Pierre. I know I never will again. And I'm very thankful that I've been able to spend as much time around him as I have, because it taught me incredible things. And George, thank you for a wonderful, wonderful career. Thank you for all of your fights. Thank you for your friendship. And thank you for the generous things you've done for me. And yeah. Enjoy the hostilities, my friend.